My son shoved me hard into the lake. The cold water swallowed me whole, and as I gasped, choking, fighting for air, I heard his voice cutting through the splashes. "Cool off, old man." He laughed as if nearly drowning me was nothing more than a childish prank. The kind of laughter that used to warm my heart now pierced me like a knife. By the time I dragged myself out of the water, shivering, my clothes clinging heavy against my skin, something inside me had shifted. I stood there on the shore water, dripping into the dirt, my breath ragged, but my resolve steady. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and with trembling hands I showed him something. The smile vanished from his face in an instant. His laughter died in his throat. He knew right then that betrayal was no longer just betrayal, it had become justice. And the consequences waiting for him would be devastating. But let me take you back to the beginning. The morning had started quietly enough, the kind of silence that only comes with old age and an empty house. The medical bill lay unfolded on the kitchen table, my weathered hands gripping the edges, like it was some sort of final verdict. $3,000 for last month's emergency room visit. At 70 years old, numbers like that didn't just sting, they suffocated. Margaret's yellow curtains filtered the morning light, soft but cruel, catching the dust motes in the still air, each one reminding me of the life we once shared. The kitchen felt smaller without her laughter filling it. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder, striking 9:30 with a chime that echoed too long. That was when the old rotary phone rang, the same one Margaret insisted we keep black bakelite, polished smooth from decades of conversations. My heart tightened when I saw the caller ID Brandon. My son rarely called before noon. "Dad," he began, his voice too cheerful, stretched thin with an artificial brightness I had grown used to over the past months. "Listen, we should, spend some time together today? At the lake." I set the bill aside and caught my reflection in the toaster's chrome surface. The wrinkles seemed deeper, the eyes more tired. "What exactly do you want to discuss, son?" "Better face-to-face family time, you understand." His voice was rushed background noise of traffic buzzing behind him. "Bring swim trunks. We'll make it fun. The kids are excited." Something in the quickness of his breathing made my chest tighten. "Brandon," I said carefully, "what's this really about?" There was a pause, then softer. "Dad, please. Can you meet us at Lake Harmony around noon?" I walked into the living room, my eyes landing on the framed photo atop the side table. Brandon, at 10 years old, gap-toothed grin stretching ear to ear, proudly holding up the fish we'd caught together. That little boy, my boy, where had he gone? When had he been replaced by this man who asked about property values, retirement accounts, and insurance policies, as if our conversations were interviews instead of family talks? "You've been different lately," I said, lowering myself into Margaret's chair, the one that still held her shape. "All those questions about the house, about my finances? I'm just concerned about your future, Dad. We all are." That word concerned hung in the air like smoke. Concerned I'd been managing fine since Margaret passed. More than fine. I'd been careful, disciplined, living the way she taught me. Still, I heard myself say, "Noon then. But Brandon, whatever this is about, we'll handle it together, like family should." There was a silence save for the hum of his car engine on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "Thanks, Dad. That means everything." But after the line went dead, I sat there listening to the hollow dial tone, a weight pressing down on my chest. Something about his voice that forced cheerfulness told me this wouldn't be just another family outing. And I was right, because a few hours later, his hands would be the ones shoving me into the lake, and my hands would be the ones holding proof that turned his cruel laughter into fear. "Thanks for what?" The question clung to me like smoke as I left the kitchen and moved toward the hallway closet. It echoed with every step, following me like a shadow I couldn't shake off. My old leather jacket hung there just where it had always been. Margaret had given it to me on my 60th birthday. Her smile, proud as she'd said it, made me look distinguished. She'd always known how to make me feel younger than I was. I brushed my fingers across the worn sleeve, the creases telling their own story of years' rain and road trips. I grabbed my keys from the hook. Their familiar weight was solid grounding, almost reassuring. Through the front window, the neighborhood played out its ordinary routine. Mrs. Chen bent over her roses, the mailman whistling the same jaunty tune he'd been whistling for decades. Everything looked peaceful, perfectly safe, and yet my hands trembled as they closed around the door handle. The garage door groaned open with its usual complaint, letting filtered sunlight spill across the concrete floor. My old Ford pickup waited there, paint dulled with age, but steady, dependable, like an old friend. I stood beside it, letting my hand slide along the cool metal of the hood. Without thinking, I popped the latch and checked the oil dipstick. Then I gave one of the tires a push with the toe of my boot, listening for the solid thump of air inside. Delay tactics. Margaret's phrase, not mine. She'd been right, of course. That was exactly what I was doing, finding excuses to stall, to avoid the thing I already knew deep down was waiting for me at Lake Harmony. 27 years of marriage had taught me to read signs, even the subtle ones Margaret never said aloud. 37 years of fatherhood had taught me something harder to read between the lines of what my son did say, and even more, what he didn't. I closed the hood gently and turned back into the house. My steps felt heavier as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, the old wood creaking in its familiar rhythm like the house itself was reminding me of every year we lived here, every memory made within these walls. The swim trunks were buried in the bottom drawer of my dresser, folded beneath sweaters I hadn't touched since last winter. As I pulled them out, something crackled. I frowned, reaching deeper, and pulled free an old photograph that had been tucked between the fabric. Lake Harmony, summer of 2019. Brandon with his arm draped around Isabel, both of them laughing, their kids splashing in the shallow water. And me grilling burgers on the portable barbecue, smiling in a way I hadn't smiled in a long time. That was before Isabel stopped answering my calls, before Brandon's voice became tight whenever money came up, before suspicion started to gnaw at the quiet spaces between us. The memory of that awkward dinner 3 weeks ago came back in sharp detail. Brandon swirling the ice in his glass, avoiding my eyes as he asked, "Dad, have you ever thought about estate planning?" I mean, really thought about it. I remembered how he gave that nervous laugh when I mentioned my financial advisor, how the room had gone suddenly cold, Margaret's empty chair at the table screaming louder than any words. I carried the swim trunks into the bathroom, setting them on the counter. My morning pill bottles waited there, lined up like soldiers, heart medication, blood pressure pills, the little daily reminders that 70 wasn't 50 anymore. I shook the tablets into my palm, staring at them for a long moment, before swallowing them down with tap water that tasted faintly metallic. The mirror above the sink didn't lie. The face staring back was mine, but older, grayer, more fragile than I ever admitted out loud. Worry lines dug deeper across my forehead than they had yesterday. The stubble along my jaw looked less like ruggedness and more like neglect. I looked like a man slowing down. I looked like a man vulnerable. I gripped the edges of the sink until my knuckles whitened. Was I overreacting? Was I twisting a simple invitation into something it wasn't? Maybe Brandon really did just want to spend time with his old man at the lake for the sake of his kids. Maybe I was the one poisoning the air with doubts. But then, clear as day, Margaret's voice whispered through my memory, "Trust your instincts, Derek." And I had. For nearly 3 decades, her instincts had never been wrong. They've never steered you wrong. Margaret's words, etched into my memory, echoed in the back of my mind as I stepped into the garage again. The air smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, a scent that had been constant for decades, like the smell of a second skin. I bent down, opened the cooler, and filled it with water bottles. The clink of plastic against ice felt louder than usual in the quiet space. From the pantry, I added a few granola bars, small things to keep me steady. Somehow it felt important to prepare, though I couldn't explain why. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration rattling against my leg like a nervous twitch. I pulled it out. A text from Brandon. "See you soon, Dad. Thanks." There it was again. Thanks. Not looking forward to seeing you. Not drive safe. Just thanks. The word landed wrong, like a key turning in the wrong lock. Thanks, as if I were doing him a favor, as if this day wasn't about family, but about some task I was unknowingly completing. As if I was solving a problem I didn't yet understand. I checked my battery, 60%, a little more than half, but not enough for comfort. On impulse, I reached into the workbench drawer and grabbed the car charger. The small coiled wire slipped into my pocket with a weight out of proportion to its size. Something told me I'd need it later, though I couldn't say why. When I locked the front door, the key in my hand felt heavier than it ever had before. I stood still on the porch, the sun warming my back, and turned to look at the house one more time. 43 years. 43 years Margaret and I had poured into this place. Every brick, every nail, every corner of that house whispered a piece of our story, our laughter, our arguments, the countless evenings spent around the dinner table. And yet as I looked at it now, something inside me twisted. Why did it feel like I might not see it the same way again when I returned? Why did it feel like I was saying goodbye? Not just stepping out for an afternoon at the lake, I slid into the driver's seat of my old Ford pickup. The leather seat groaned under my weight just like it always had, but instead of comfort, it sounded like protest. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, veins standing out, knuckles pale. The engine rumbled to life, a steady hum I usually found reassuring. Today, though, it was hollow, like a song played in the wrong key. I reversed slowly, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror. The curtains Margaret had chosen swayed gently in the upstairs window. Then the street curved and my home was gone from sight. The transition from city streets to rural highway took exactly 40 minutes the way it always had. Each passing mile marker felt like a countdown. Fields of tall grass rippled in the wind, barns weathered gray with age stood watch over the land, and every so often a hawk traced wide circles in the sky. I should have found it peaceful. Instead, my pulse ticked louder than the turn signal. Finally, Lake Harmony appeared through the trees. The view hit me the way it always had, like stepping into a memory. Blue water spread wide and calm, mirroring the July sky above it. Pines stood tall around the lake guardians that had outlived generations, their green needles whispering in the summer breeze. It was beautiful, timeless, almost enough to make me believe my fears were foolish. Almost. The parking lot was only half full. I spotted Brandon's SUV right away, its glossy paint glinting in the sunlight. Parked beside it, I noticed the familiar signs of family life car seats strapped in the back, a scattering of toys left behind, juice boxes wedged between the seats coloring books, with crayon marks bleeding over the edges. And Emma's stuffed elephant, the one with the missing ear, slumped against the window. Normal chaos. Family chaos. For the first time that day, the weight in my chest loosened just a little. How serious could anything be, I thought, when there were still children's toys and forgotten snacks in the car? Grandpa. The sound of Emma's voice cut through the warm summer air, clear and bright like sunlight breaking through cloud. 8 years old, all energy and joy, she barreled toward me, arms wide, her little sneakers pounding against the gravel. Behind her, James sprinted too, his 6-year-old legs pumping furiously to keep up with his sister. I bent down, catching Emma in a bear hug, her laughter bubbling out as I lifted her off the ground and spun her once, twice. Her giggle was music, a reminder that innocence still existed in the world. "Missed you, Grandpa," she squealed. And for just that moment, holding her close, everything felt right again. "Easy there, sweetheart. You'll make your old grandpa dizzy," I laughed, my voice catching with both joy and a quiet ache I didn't let her see. Emma's hair smelled faintly of sunscreen and bubblegum shampoo as I hugged her tighter. Before I could set her down, James came barreling into my legs with the force of a small cannonball, his arms clamping tight around my waist. "Can we go swimming now?" Grandpa Mom packed our suits and everything. I chuckled, steadying myself so we wouldn't all topple over. "After we eat lunch, buddy." "Patience," I said, ruffling his dark hair. It was uncanny, so much like Brandon's had been at that age, the same stubborn cowlick that no brush could tame. Good things come to those who wait. The kids groaned, but the innocence in their voices made my chest tighten. Childhood was supposed to be simple, free of the heaviness that weighed down grown-ups. Over their heads, I caught sight of Brandon and Isabel, walking toward us from the picnic tables. Isabel's frame seemed thinner than I remembered, her steps slower, as though the weight of invisible burdens pressed her down. Her smile was there, yes, but it was brittle, a paper-thin mask that cracked the moment her eyes flicked away from mine. She busied herself with smoothing James's hair, where I'd mussed it, her hands trembling slightly, avoiding my gaze altogether. Brandon, though. Brandon was different in a way that set every nerve in me on edge. His shoulders were squared, but not with confidence, with tension. His eyes darted too quickly, never resting, his jaw working silently when he thought no one was watching. One hand hovered near his pocket, constantly checking his phone every few seconds like it was a lifeline. "Dad," he said at last, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Thanks for coming." Really? The word again, thanks. It was starting to sound like a rehearsed line, something he'd been practicing on the drive over. Even the clap on the shoulder felt wrong, too firm, too staged, like an actor playing the role of grateful son. Beautiful day, isn't it? He added, forcing a grin. It is, I answered, though my voice was measured. I studied his face in the light. The dark circles under his eyes told stories he hadn't shared nights spent awake with thoughts he wasn't ready to confess. The way his jaw tensed when silence fell between us was louder than any words he could have spoken. How's business been, son? I asked quietly, giving him a chance to meet me halfway. Good, good. You know how it is, he replied quickly, almost too quickly, the words tripping over each other. Then came the laugh, hollow, brittle, the sound of glass ready to shatter. The children's voices rang nearby, their excitement a contrast to the weight pressing down on the adults. Brandon turned voice louder, too cheerful. Hey kids, why don't you go throw the frisbee over by those trees? Grown-ups need to chat for a bit. Emma's mouth twisted into a pout. But we just got here. Go on, Isabel said softly, her voice calm but firm, though I noticed how her hands fidgeted with the edge of the picnic blanket. We won't be long. Reluctantly, the children obeyed, trudging off with the frisbee in hand, though their steps lacked the bounce they'd had a moment ago. Emma kept glancing back at us, her wide eyes carrying an unspoken question her young mind couldn't quite form, but already sensed. Children had a way of detecting tension adults thought they'd hidden well. When the kids were out of earshot, the three of us settled onto the weathered picnic bench. The wood creaked beneath our weight, rough and splintered from years of sun and rain. Only 20 feet away, the lake lapped gently against the shore, the sound rhythmic, almost soothing. The pine trees swayed above their sharp scent, mingling with the earthy tang of lake water. It should have been peaceful. It should have been the kind of moment that healed families, not broke them apart. But beneath it all, the silence carried a heaviness that no summer breeze could lift. Brandon cleared his throat. Once. Twice. His Adam's apple bobbed as though swallowing words he couldn't quite spit out. Isabel sat rigid, twisting a napkin in her hands until it tore down the middle, the sound of ripping paper slicing through the fragile quiet. I sat there waiting, my heart heavy, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. Dad. Brandon finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight I'd never quite heard before. It wasn't just seriousness, it was strain, the kind of heaviness that comes when a man has rehearsed words he doesn't want to say, but feels cornered into speaking. We need to talk. I sat there caught between my son and my daughter-in-law, the wooden bench creaking faintly beneath our weight. The warmth of the summer sun pressed against my arms, but beneath it a chill ran the length of my spine. It was the kind of chill that came not from the air, but from instinct, the body's warning system that something was coming. The lake stretched out before us, glassy and calm, timeless in its quiet beauty. But I could feel the tension coiling tighter, like storm clouds gathering just out of sight, ready to split the sky open. Across the water, Emma's laughter rang out high and pure, chasing after the frisbee James had thrown a little too high. Their carefree voices carried easily across the breeze, untouched by whatever storm was about to crash down on their family. I folded my hands on the table, steadying myself, and waited for Brandon to continue. Dad, you know how real estate markets are these days? Brandon began, his tone carrying that practiced casualness I'd heard him use on clients he wanted to win over. Too smooth, too careful. He glanced across the park, watching Emma and James sprint toward the playground, confirming they were far enough away not to overhear. Then with deliberate calm, he leaned forward. Your house has appreciated significantly. I shifted slightly on the bench, putting just the smallest sliver of distance between us, needing air. Isabel didn't speak. Her hands worked furiously at the paper napkin in her lap, twisting it until it tore into shreds, white pieces scattering across the weathered wood like fallen snow. Her silence screamed more loudly than anything she could have said aloud. My voice was calm, even though inside I felt my defenses rising. What exactly is this business opportunity, son? And why the sudden urgency? Brandon exhaled too sharply, and his palms pressed flat against the table, leaving faint damp prints. His jaw flexed as though forcing himself to stay composed. Well, you see, there's this cash flow situation. Temporary, of course, but the timing is critical. He hesitated, then added quickly. And your house, it's just sitting there, Dad. All that equity doing nothing. The words hit me like cold water. They were too polished, too deliberate. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. He had rehearsed this speech probably with Isabel, maybe even in front of the mirror. Every word had been chosen, carefully designed to make desperation sound like practicality. "I've lived in that house for 40 years, I said quietly, each word carrying the weight of memory. "Your mother and I raised you there. Her garden still blooms every spring. Every corner of that house holds a piece of her, of us." Brandon's composure slipped his voice, rising a notch, frustration seeping through the cracks in his carefully built facade. "But Dad, think practically. You're rattling around in all that space alone. The maintenance, the property taxes, it's become a burden, hasn't it?" I studied him closely, the dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase, the way his jaw clenched between sentences as if trying to bite back the truth. This wasn't about practicality. This was about desperation. And in that moment, I realized just how far away the boy with the gap-toothed smile in the fishing photo had drifted. "How much money are we talking about, Brandon?" My voice was calm, deliberate though. Inside, I felt the tension coil tighter with every passing second. "And what happens if this opportunity doesn't pan out?" His answers came too quickly, tumbling out like dice on a rigged table. First it was a few months, then a couple of weeks, then suddenly, immediately. The time frame shifted like sand under my feet. The amounts were no better, vague phrases that sounded rehearsed enough to secure our future more than you'd expect. No real numbers, no substance. Just words meant to dazzle and confuse. Beside him, Isabel closed her eyes, her lashes trembling against her cheeks, as though the very conversation caused her physical pain. When she opened them again, they glistened heavy with unshed tears. She didn't look at me. She looked through me as though ashamed to be part of this. "Where would I live?" I asked quietly, though the weight in my voice made the question fall heavy between us. For the first time, Isabel spoke. Her voice was soft, fragile, barely rising above a whisper. We've looked at our budget. There's room for you with us. The kids would love having Grandpa around all the time." The words struck me like a blow to the chest. This wasn't spur of the moment. They had coordinated this. They had discussed my living arrangements, my future, without ever consulting me. The sound of Emma and James laughing carried faintly from the playground, sweet and innocent. And yet, in that moment, I realized their laughter had been twisted into something else: emotional leverage. My grandchildren were being used as bargaining chips in a game they didn't even know existed. I straightened, my voice firmer now, cutting through Brandon's smooth, rehearsed lines. "Brandon, what aren't you telling me? What's really happening here?" The mask began to slip. I saw it in the twitch of his jaw, the way his hands shook as he brushed his damp palms against his shorts. Sweat gathered on his forehead despite the lake breeze. His voice dropped low, hurried, raw. "Dad, you don't understand. This isn't just about opportunity anymore. There are people involved. Commitments made." A cold weight settled in my chest. "What kind of commitments?" The kind, he said, avoiding my eyes that don't wait for convenient timing. For a heartbeat silence stretched between us. My paternal instincts, the part of me that had always wanted to shield him from pain, warred with the cold alarm spreading through me. 40 years of reading my son's face told me one thing: he was genuinely afraid. But 40 years of being his father told me another truth, just as sharp. Whatever mess he had gotten himself into, he was trying to drag me down into it with him. No. The word left my mouth like a stone thrown into still water. It landed heavy, final, rippling outward into the silence. Brandon's face transformed instantly. The careful mask of reason, the polished smile of a salesman, crumbled. In its place was something raw, desperate, something dangerous. His eyes flickered with anger, his mouth tightening into a line that looked more like threat than plea. I rose slowly from the bench, every movement deliberate, steady. The lake shimmered behind me, timeless and calm, but my voice carried the weight of 7 decades of hard-earned wisdom. "No," I repeated, standing tall. And in that moment, I was no longer just a father confronted by a son's desperation. I was a man drawing a line that would not be crossed. "That house means everything to me, son," I said, my voice steady but weighted with memories so heavy they threatened to break me. "It's where your mother took her last breath, where we celebrated your first steps, where every wall holds a piece of who we are. I will not sell the heart of this family to patch over someone else's emergency. Instead of understanding, Brandon exploded. He shot up from the bench so violently that the chair legs scraped against the concrete with a piercing shriek. The sound cut through the peaceful lake air like a blade. He began pacing back and forth the way a caged animal circles when it knows there's no escape, his voice climbing higher and higher until it bordered on hysteria. "You stubborn old fool." His words were spit more than spoken. "Don't you get it? This isn't optional anymore." His arms flailed, his hands gesturing wildly as if the sheer motion could force me to see what he saw. "You think this is about me wanting money? You think I have choices here?" Isabel reached for him, then her trembling hand catching his arm in a desperate pleading grip. But Brandon shook her off with such violence that she stumbled back, fear flashing across her face. She looked smaller in that moment, fragile and helpless, as though she'd been enduring this storm far longer than I realized. I sat still, studying my son, my boy, who once clung to my hand crossing the street, who once cried when a scraped knee felt like the end of the world. Now here he was, unraveling before me, driven by something so dark and relentless it terrified him beyond reason. "Brandon," I said quietly, trying to anchor him with my voice, "what exactly are you so afraid of?" He stopped pacing and stepped closer, closing the gap between us. At 70, I had grown slightly stooped with age, but my son, 40 years younger, taller, stronger, used every inch of that difference to loom over me. His shadow fell across my lap like a warning. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said through clenched teeth. His voice was lower now, guttural, almost animal. The kind of people who don't accept excuses. A chill cut through me, sharper than the breeze off the water. My hand moved instinctively toward my phone. "Let me call Richard Wilson," I offered quickly, trying to inject reason. "He's handled situations like this." Legal advice. "No lawyers." Brandon's roar erupted, bouncing off the water, startling birds into flight. His face twisted red with panic. "No outside help. This gets handled family style. Or it doesn't get handled at all." My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm, to stay deliberate. While pretending to dial, I slid my thumb across the screen and started recording. I held the phone casually, naturally, as if in conversation. The small red dot blinked at me, steady and unyielding, just as Brandon's grip on reality fractured before my eyes. "Cool off, old man," he sneered, his voice cracking under the strain. Then his hands were on me, his fingers digging into my shoulders, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to remind me that he was no longer the boy I could lift onto my shoulders. "Maybe a reality check will help you think straight." The shove came without warning. Sudden, brutal, 40 years younger, 40 pounds heavier, fueled by desperation. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping against the uneven ground, and then the world tilted. The lake rushed up to meet me in a blur of sky and water. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. Lake Harmony swallowed me whole, its cold grip shocking against the warmth of the July air. Water surged into my nose and mouth, burning, choking as I flailed. The temperature difference hit my chest like a fist, making my heart flutter and stutter out of rhythm. My clothes, soaked, instantly became leaden anchors, dragging me down. My shoes sank into the muddy bottom, offering no purchase, no way to push back up. I clawed toward the surface, arms and legs thrashing against the pull of the lake, gasping when my mouth found the briefest pocket of air. The phone, still clutched in my hand by some primal instinct, remained raised above me, the one fragile piece of evidence glowing faintly in the dim light as the red recording dot blinked on. The water closed in again, black and endless, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the sharp edge of fear, real, consuming, primal fear. The water wasn't deep enough to drown me outright, but it was deep enough to be dangerous for a man of 70. My chest heaved against the shock, my heart stumbling into an irregular rhythm as the icy grip of Lake Harmony clamped down on me. My limbs ached instantly, leaden with cold, and for a moment the disorientation was almost worse than the chill itself. Hypothermia, that word slid into my mind like a whisper from memory, carrying all the warnings doctors had once given me about my heart. And yet, instead of rushing toward me, instead of even extending a hand, Brandon stood at the water's edge and laughed. Not the nervous kind of laughter that breaks tension. No, this was darker. It was cruel satisfaction tangled with the jagged edges of stress-induced hysteria. Maybe now you'll think straight instead of being sentimental about some old house, he jeered, his voice carrying sharp and mocking across the lake. Sometimes people need encouragement to see reason. Each word cut through me, not just as a father, but as a man realizing his son had crossed a line that could never be undone. On the shore, Isabel stood rooted to the ground. Her hands were pressed to her mouth, muffling a small gasp, her eyes wide with horror. Yet she didn't move, didn't run forward, didn't protest. She was paralyzed in that narrow space between loyalty to her husband and revulsion at what she had just witnessed. And in the distance, almost cruelly, the laughter of children drifted from the playground. Emma and James, my grandchildren, were giggling, chasing each other in carefree games, blissfully unaware that their grandfather was chest-deep in cold water, fighting for balance, while their father stood there, watching with satisfaction. I finally managed to plant my feet firmly on the muddy bottom, my shoes sinking into the muck until I found purchase. My body trembled, but I forced myself upright. Water streamed from my clothes in rivulets dripping down my arms and face, but inside me, something else had shifted. I looked up at my son, not as a father to his child, but as a man seeing another man clearly for the first time. And what I saw was both devastating and clarifying. Slowly, deliberately, I began to wade back toward the shore. Each step through the dragging water felt heavy but purposeful. Confusion had drained from me. What replaced it was colder than the lake itself clarity. A clarity that told me this moment would divide everything before from everything after. Brandon and Isabel stood waiting at the bank, both watching with uncertain eyes. They expected anger. They expected me to rage, to shout, to plead. But I said nothing. My silence, deliberate cutting, unnerved them more than any outburst could have. I stepped onto the muddy shore shoes, squelching with every movement, and walked past Brandon without even a glance. My soaked clothes clung to my skin, heavy as lead, but my back was straight. I did not falter. I did not look at him. Behind me, his voice cracked, not with authority, not with mockery, but with something I had never heard from him before: panic. "Dad, come on. Let's talk about this. Like reasonable people." Still, I kept walking, my silence more final than words. Isabel followed at a distance, her footsteps crunching against gravel with a hesitant rhythm. Something in her, perhaps maternal instinct, seemed to understand that something fundamental had just shifted in our family, that the fragile balance had been broken beyond repair. By the time I reached my old Ford, I could hear Brandon's hurried steps closing the gap between us. Desperation had entered his stride, quick and uneven. I turned then finally to face him. The wet fabric clung to my body, my hair plastered to my forehead, but my gaze was steady, sharpened by a resolve he had never seen in me before. And for the first time in years, my son looked small. Water continued dripping from my clothes in steady rivulets, forming dark, uneven puddles on the hot asphalt beneath my feet. My breath still carried the sharp bite of the lake, but my hands were steady as I raised my phone, the screen glowing unmistakably with a red recording dot. I tilted it just enough for Brandon to see. At first, his face held only confusion, a flicker of disbelief. But then realization struck like a hammer blow. His features twisted, horror, fear, rage, all colliding at once. His voice cracked as it burst out of him. You recorded that. You recorded our private family conversation?" I didn't flinch. My voice came out as cold and unyielding as the lake water still clinging to my skin. "I recorded everything, Brandon. Every word you said, every gesture, every moment you assaulted your 70-year-old father. It's all here." The phone felt like both shield and sword in my hand. He lunged forward, desperation taking over, fingers outstretched to snatch it. But I stepped back, my movements measured, calm. "Touch me again," I warned, my voice razor sharp. "And this video goes straight to the Minneapolis Police Department. I know exactly which laws you've broken today." His aggression crumbled, collapsing into raw panic. His hands shook as he held them out, not in surrender, but in frantic appeal. "Dad, wait, please. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. These people, the kind of people who will hurt my family if I don't. I understand assault when I see it." I cut him off with surgical precision. "And I understand elder abuse. Minnesota law takes both very seriously, Brandon, especially when there's clear video evidence." The words landed like blows. His chest heaved, his voice cracked under the weight of desperation. You can't seriously be thinking about calling the police on your own son, on your grandchildren's father. But I was already pulling my car keys from my pocket. The sharp jingle of metal sounded final, like the closing of a door. I opened the car door, the hinges groaning in the silence between us. I'm thinking I said evenly about protecting myself from someone who just proved he's willing to use violence against his own blood for money. Behind him, Isabel stood mute, her face pale, her arms folded tight against her chest as if to contain the storm inside her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything Brandon had said. It carried the weight of acknowledgement that a line had been crossed, one that could never be erased. I looked at them not as the father who had once held his son's hand through first steps, or the grandfather who had always shown unconditional love to Emma and James. No, I looked at them now with the cold assessment of a stranger weighing risks, drawing boundaries. Brandon, I said, my voice steady, you'll be hearing from my attorney. This video will be presented in whatever legal proceedings follow. I slid into the driver's seat, water from my soaked clothes seeping into the upholstery, and started the engine. The low rumble seemed to break the stillness like thunder. They stood frozen on the asphalt, Isabel with her silence, Brandon with his crumbling bravado. Through the open window, I delivered my final words, each syllable deliberate, each one a verdict. I suggest you use whatever time you have left to figure out how to explain this to Emma and James. My hand tightened on the wheel. I held his gaze one last time, his eyes wide, desperate, almost childlike in their panic. Then with quiet finality, I said, "Watch me." And I drove away. I drove away slowly, the tires crunching against the gravel path as the rearview mirror captured the shrinking silhouettes of Brandon and Isabel. They stood motionless at the water's edge, two small figures swallowed by the vast emptiness of what used to be a family gathering, filled with laughter, food, and promises of togetherness. Now all that remained was silence, an echo of betrayal hanging over the peaceful, rippling lake. Lake Harmony sparkled in the afternoon sun, as if mocking the storm that had just erupted on its shores. To anyone else, it looked serene, a picture of summer tranquility. But for me, its shimmering surface had become a cruel mirror, reflecting back not beauty, but the shattered fragments of a family destroyed by greed and desperation. The full weight of what had just happened hadn't pressed down on me yet. My body moved on autopilot, my grip firm yet trembling on the steering wheel. I knew the shock would come later when the silence of the night wrapped around me, and there was no distraction to keep the memories at bay. For now, I had to cling to the facts. I had evidence, I had witnesses. And for the first time in this long, bitter struggle, I had the power to ensure that no one would ever raise a hand against me again in the twisted name of family loyalty. The heater blasted inside the car, trying to chase the cold lake water from my clothes. Steam rose faintly from my sleeves, but the chill had settled deeper than skin. It was inside me, in my chest, in my bones. The radio, oblivious to my inner storm, hummed to life, tuned to an oldies station. Sweet Caroline. The familiar melody drifted from the speakers, tender and cruel in equal measure. My throat tightened instantly. Brandon used to sing along to that song when he was a boy, strapped into his car seat, his little legs kicking in rhythm. We'd play it during long drives to fishing trips, both of us off-key, but laughing anyway. For a moment, the sound of his childish voice filled my ears, overlapping with the man he had become, the man who had shoved his 70-year-old father into a lake. 30 minutes into the drive, muscle memory steered me off the road almost without thinking. I pulled over at the old oak tree, the one that had stood sentinel by the roadside for as long as I could remember. Its sprawling branches stretched toward the sky, just as they had when Brandon was a boy. Here beneath this tree, life had once been simpler. I had crouched down on the grass with my son guiding his small fingers as he struggled to tie fishing knots. I had watched his brow furrow in concentration, then light up with triumph when he finally succeeded. We had shared peanut butter sandwiches under this canopy, sticky fingers, and wide smiles, sketching plans for weekend adventures that never seemed long enough. I killed the engine and sat there for a long moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor. My wet clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin, but I hardly noticed. Slowly, with hands that still trembled faintly, I reached into my wallet. Behind my driver's license, tucked away like a talisman, was a photograph. It was old, its edges frayed from years of being handled, but the image was still clear. Brandon, at 10 years old, his gap-toothed grin stretching ear to ear, holding up his very first catch, a tiny bluegill that could have been a marlin judging by his expression of pure, unfiltered joy. His eyes had sparkled then, brighter than the lake itself, as though the world held nothing but wonder. The sight of that photograph hit me harder than the cold water ever could. My chest constricted, the air refusing to come easily. That innocent boy, the one who cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly, the one who hugged me fiercely after losing a baseball game, had grown into a man who looked me in the eye and shoved me into a lake. And as I sat beneath that oak tree staring at the smiling child frozen in time, the truth washed over me with brutal clarity. The boy I loved was gone. What stood on that shore today was someone else entirely. The boy who once fell asleep holding my hand during car rides home from fishing trips. The boy who trusted me so completely that my presence alone could soothe his tired little body had now stood before me as a man who threatened violence simply because I refused to sell my home. The transformation was so brutal, so incomprehensible, that my mind kept circling the same question: where had I gone wrong? Was it something in his teenage years when rebellion burned bright, and I chose patience over confrontation, thinking he would eventually grow out of it? Or had I been too strict, too insistent on grades and responsibility, pushing him so hard that resentment fermented into bitterness? Perhaps I had focused so intently on the child, I remembered the boy who once sobbed when he dropped his ice cream cone, that I had been blind to the man he was becoming. I leaned back against the rough bark of the oak tree, its strength pressing into my shoulders, and whispered to the branches above me, "How do you grieve someone who is still alive but lost to you?" The question wasn't new. Margaret, my late wife's closest friend, had asked the very same thing years ago when her sister descended into the grip of addiction. Back then I nodded sympathetically, but I hadn't truly understood. Now I did. The pain wasn't the clean, merciful finality of death. It was the sharp, lingering ache of watching someone you love morph into a stranger who wears your child's face but carries none of their innocence. Every memory I reached for now felt poisoned. Teaching him to drive in this very stretch of road, his nervous laughter filling the air as my hand hovered over the emergency brake, standing tall with pride at his college graduation, clapping until my hands stung, walking him down the aisle at his wedding to Isabel, tears of joy blurring my vision as I thought I was handing her a good man, a safe partner. Had any of those moments been real? Or had I simply been a fool projecting the father I wanted to be onto the son I wanted to believe in? The sharp buzz of my phone snapped me out of the spiral. It rattled against the passenger seat, insistent, demanding attention. I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to. Whatever words glowed on that screen, they could wait. Still, its presence was enough to remind me that this wasn't only about memory or nostalgia or grief. This was about survival, about safety, about protecting my home, my dignity, and perhaps, most painfully, my grandchildren who had no idea how close their lives were to the chaos their father had unleashed. With deliberate care, I folded the old photograph and slid it back into my wallet behind my driver's license. I paused for a moment, pressing the leather shut as if sealing away not just a picture, but an entire lifetime. The boy in that photograph, the one with the gap-toothed smile and the fishing rod twice his size, deserved to be remembered. He deserved my love. But the man he had chosen to become, that was someone else's burden. I started the engine, the car vibrating gently as it came back to life. The oak tree faded into the distance as I pulled onto the highway, the sun beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for such a broken day. Whatever message waited on my phone, whatever storm was coming, in the wake of today's events, I would face it. Not as a victim, not as a man cornered, but as the same father who had once raised a boy with infinite patience, unwavering love, and the belief that kindness could shape a life. Even if that child had forgotten how to return to me. When I finally reached home, I expected relief. I expected safety. Instead, as I pushed open the front door, silence greeted me like an unwelcome guest. The house stood exactly as it always had, the familiar furniture, the scent of wood polish, the photos lining the hallway walls, and yet it all felt different, hollow, like a shell still standing strong but emptied of its heart. For the first time, my home didn't feel like protection. It felt like memory. I stripped off my wet clothes the moment I stepped inside and dropped them directly into the washing machine, not even bothering to sort them. They clung to my skin like a second punishment, heavy and cold, as though they wanted to remind me of the humiliation of being shoved into the lake by my own son. When the machine whirred to life, I walked straight to the bathroom and stood beneath the hottest shower water I could bear. Steam filled the small room, fogging the mirror, but no amount of heat could reach the chill that had already taken root in my chest. My body warmed, my skin reddened, but inside I remained frozen. In the kitchen, I moved automatically as though on autopilot. I sliced a carrot, opened a can of broth, let the small pot simmer while crackers sat untouched beside it. The smell of soup once meant comfort in this house, especially during winters when Margaret would hum softly as she stirred. Tonight, the scent only made me ache. I managed 3 spoonfuls before pushing the bowl away, appetite gone. It had disappeared somewhere between Brandon's first threat and his final shove into the water. At 70 years old, stress didn't pass through me the way it once did. It lodged in my bones, slowed my heartbeat, pressed against my lungs, until even breathing felt like effort. Everything seemed more fragile now, more consequential. My body no longer had the resilience to bounce back from betrayal. And betrayal, especially by your own blood, wasn't something you could digest with soup. The evening light slanted through Margaret's old curtains, the ones she'd chosen with such care decades ago. Dust danced in the fading gold as if time itself was mocking me, reminding me of all that had passed in this house. I sank into her favorite chair, the floral fabric worn smooth by years of her presence. Around me, I had gathered a pile of photo albums pulled hastily from the bookshelf. I opened one. Birthdays. Brandon with frosting on his nose at age 5, candles burning bright while I clapped behind the camera. Another page, his high school graduation tassel hanging proudly as I stood next to him, chest bursting with pride. Christmas mornings, wrapping paper flying, his gap-toothed grin reflected in the glow of string lights. Now every picture felt like a riddle, a puzzle I had somehow failed to solve in time. Had the warning signs always been there? A stubborn set of his jaw, a selfish gleam in his eye that I excused as youthful determination. Had I been blind, or worse, willfully blind, because the truth would have been too painful to admit? For a moment I considered calling Richard Wilson, my old friend and lawyer. Richard had a steady voice, the kind of voice that made problems sound solvable, but my hand hovered over the phone before I set it down again. Not tonight. Not yet. Legal action against your own son required more than anger. It required clarity, evidence, resolve. And though I had all 3 in fragments, they had not yet settled into the shape of a decision. The video evidence wasn't going anywhere, and rushing into criminal charges felt premature. Tonight wasn't about action. It was about facing the reality of who my son had become. By 9:30 p.m., the house had settled into silence so complete it was almost unbearable. That was when my phone chimed, startling me in the stillness. The screen lit up, and the sender's name froze me in place. Isabel. She had my number only because of the school emergency contact list for Emma and James. I'd barely thought about it before, just a precaution, a practical detail. Now that small fact carried a weight I hadn't expected. Her message appeared longer than her usual polite exchanges. Even in the preview text, I saw the urgency, the desperation. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. Durkika, I'm so sorry about today. Brandon is under enormous pressure from dangerous people. They're threatening him, threatening us all. Can we meet tomorrow, just us? He doesn't know I'm contacting you. Please. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, letting each word sink in deeper, heavier. Dangerous people. Not a family squabble, not just greed. This was bigger, darker than I'd realized. My eyes lingered on the words, he doesn't know I'm contacting you. Isabel was risking Brandon's wrath, risking her own safety to send this message, which meant the danger wasn't abstract. It was real, immediate, close enough that she feared even her husband's knowledge of her plea. Suddenly, my grief for the son I'd lost was tangled with something else, dread. The kind of dread that crawls up your spine and whispers that this story isn't just about betrayal, it's about survival. My paternal instincts battled with a darker memory, the image of Isabel standing frozen on the dock yesterday, her silence cutting deeper than Brandon's shove. She had watched her husband force his 70-year-old father into a lake without lifting a hand to stop him. The betrayal stung almost as much as the act itself. Yet even as anger rose, doubt tugged at me. Maybe she hadn't been indifferent. Maybe she'd been trapped caught between her loyalty to Brandon and her fear of something worse, something she couldn't risk revealing in that moment. Her message echoed in my mind, each word heavy with implication threats against us all. The phrase sent a shiver through me that the night's warmth couldn't touch. Did us all mean Emma and James too? My grandchildren innocent, bright, full of laughter, had I underestimated the gravity of what was happening by reducing it to a mere family quarrel over money? The thought that danger might already be closing in on them made my stomach twist. I forced my hand steady as I composed my reply. Every word had to strike a balance calm enough not to alarm her, open enough to invite truth. Tomorrow, Rainier AM, Cozy Corner Cafe on Main Street. Come alone. Her response came within minutes, fast enough to confirm both her urgency and her fear. Thank you. I'll explain everything. When I set the phone down, the silence of the house pressed in on me. I checked the locks twice, 3 times if I'm honest, and walked through each room turning off the lights. Shadows lengthened across the walls and, though I told myself I was being cautious, the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Tomorrow's meeting would either untangle misunderstandings or confirm that my family was caught in something far darker than I could have imagined. Either way, I would face it. 70 years of hardship, loss, and survival had taught me one thing. Retreat was never an option. I arrived at Cozy Corner Cafe 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Habit, discipline, nerves, all of it pulled me to be early. I chose a corner table deliberately where I could see both the entrance and the parking lot without turning my head. The morning rush hummed around me, cups clinking, baristas, calling names, low chatter that formed a protective background for a conversation no one else needed to hear. Safety in numbers, but also anonymity. A waitress set down my black coffee, and I pulled out my phone one more time. The video of yesterday's confrontation glared back at me. Brandon's voice harsh, his shove unflinching, the splash of water sealing the betrayal. I forced myself to watch it again, not out of masochism, but as preparation. If Isabel tried to explain away his actions, I needed to remember the reality, the raw evidence of what had happened. At exactly 10:00, she walked in. Isabel's punctuality wasn't surprising. Her appearance was. Sunglasses on a cloudy July morning, a light scarf wound tightly around her neck. The choices seemed less like fashion and more like shields. My eyes narrowed, cataloging every detail. She moved cautiously, her gaze sweeping the cafe with the sharpness of someone expecting danger. Not graceful, but deliberate. Her steps betrayed nerves, maybe fear. When she finally spotted me, she hesitated for a breath before approaching. As she removed her sunglasses, the mask crumbled. Exhaustion carved deep lines into her face. The vibrant woman I once knew, the one who hosted birthdays with warmth and patience, looked hollow now. Her eyes were ringed with dark circles, and when she reached for the coffee I had ordered for her, her hands trembled so badly she nearly spilled it. "I'm so sorry about yesterday," she whispered, voice thin, frayed at the edges. I studied her, silent, letting the words hang. Sorry. Sorry for watching. Sorry for Brandon. Or sorry because things had already spun out of control. What Brandon did was inexcusable. She continued quickly, as if afraid I might cut her off. But Derek, you need to understand the pressure he's been under. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, but anchored with steel. What kind of pressure makes a man assault his own father? Her eyes darted around the cafe, scanning faces, windows, doors. When she finally met my gaze again, it wasn't defiance I saw. It was fear, raw, consuming fear. And for the first time since yesterday, I realized this wasn't just about my son's temper or his greed. Isabel wasn't nervous because she'd betrayed me. She was nervous because she believed someone, somewhere, might already be watching. 6 months ago, Isabel began, her voice brittle as glass. Brandon borrowed money for what he truly believed was a legitimate business expansion. On the surface, everything seemed right. The paperwork, the offices, the way they carried themselves. They looked professional, official. He thought he was stepping into a golden opportunity. Her hands trembled as she reached for the coffee, then set it back down untouched. But the terms started to change. Interest rates climbed higher each month. Penalties appeared out of nowhere, tacked on like traps laid in fine print he never saw. It wasn't a business deal at all, it was a snare. She shifted in her seat and with a hesitant motion pushed her sleeves up just enough to expose her wrists. My breath caught. Deep purple bruises encircled her skin, ugly bands of violence hidden beneath the scarf. "These aren't from Brandon," she whispered quickly, almost as though she feared I might leap to the wrong conclusion. "They're from visitors who came to our house last week when he wasn't home. Men I'd never seen before. They wanted to make sure I understood just how serious Brandon's business relationship had become." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. The cafe noise faded, replaced by the rush of blood pounding in my ears. "They threatened you," I said, my voice rougher than I intended in your own home. Her nod was slow, her eyes wet. "Worse than that, they showed me photos of Emma and James, walking to school, smiling, holding hands, innocent." Her voice broke into a tremor. "They showed me those pictures as proof of how easily they could reach our children." A cold blade of horror sliced through me, settling deep into my chest. Suddenly, every strange choice, every tense silence, every burst of anger from Brandon made sense. This wasn't about greed. This was survival. That's when I knew. Isabel continued, pressing a napkin to her trembling lips. This had moved far beyond money. Brandon's desperation about selling the house, the urgency, the way he lashed out, it wasn't because he wanted cash to line his pockets. It was terror driving him. He was trying to save his children the only way he knew how. I forced myself to breathe steadily, to keep my voice calm, though every muscle in me screamed for action. "How much does he owe them?" Her eyes dropped to the table, shame and fear mingling in her expression. "It started at 50,000. With interest and penalties, it's grown to nearly 200,000. They want it paid by the end of this week." She leaned forward, her voice now a thin whisper. "If not, they promise to move from threats to action." The words pressed on my chest like a stone. "I didn't contact you about the house sale," she admitted, her eyes searching mine with desperate hope. "I contacted you because I don't know how else to protect Emma and James. Brandon's pride won't let him ask for help. But these men, they're not going to wait much longer." I studied her face, every line carved by fear, every glance darting as if she expected danger to walk through the cafe doors. There was no performance here, just a mother fighting for her children. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Why wait until things escalated to violence? Tears welled in her eyes. "Brandon made me promise. He said involving you would only make things worse, that it would drag you into this, put more family at risk." I believed him, but after yesterday, after seeing what desperation drove him to do. She dabbed her eyes with the napkin, shaking her head. I realized that staying silent was protecting no one. The weight of it all settled over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't simply a story of family dysfunction or a son blinded by money. No, this was life and death. My grandchildren's lives balanced on a razor's edge, caught between their father's recklessness and the ruthless hands of men who already proved how close they could reach. I leaned in, my voice low and urgent. "These people who threatened you, did you see their faces? Hear their names?" Isabel shook her head immediately, fresh fear flashing in her eyes. "They were careful, too careful. No names, no slips. Professional in the worst possible way." I sat back in my chair, my pulse hammering, processing the transformation of what I once thought was betrayal into something far more chilling. My son hadn't just assaulted me. He had been flailing in terror, trying to shield his children with whatever resources he could claw together, even if it meant burning bridges and destroying the very family ties that might have saved him. The question that now loomed wasn't about judgment. It was about survival. Was there still time to find a solution, or had the countdown already begun on something irreversible? Later back home, I hung my coat in the same closet where my jacket still rested from that disastrous trip to the lake. The gesture felt symbolic, like closing a circle, or perhaps stepping into a new one, darker and more dangerous than before. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't sure if 70 years of hard-won strength would be enough for what lay ahead. 2 days ago, I had walked out of this house as a grandfather worried about his son's erratic behavior. Now, stepping back inside, I carried the crushing weight of knowledge, the true scope of the crisis, threatening not just my son, but every member of my family. The soup and sandwich I had set out for myself sat cold and mostly untouched on the kitchen table, a silent testament to my inability to eat. My stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from dread haunted by Isabel's trembling voice, and the bruises she revealed by the terror in her eyes when she described strangers photographing Emma and James at school. The thought of my grandchildren being stalked, watched by faceless men with unknown intentions, gnawed at me in a way no financial dispute ever could. This was no longer a matter of family disagreements over money or property. This was criminal, organized, ruthless. My grandchildren were essentially hostages, pawns in a game being played by men who thrived on fear and intimidation. I drifted into the living room and lowered myself into Margaret's chair, the one I hadn't dared to touch since her funeral 6 months ago. The cushions still bore the faint imprint of her presence, and for the first time in months I let myself sink into them. How often had she solved problems I thought unsolvable, guiding me with her sharp mind and steady hand? She had been the strategist of our marriage, the one who could cut through panic with clear, actionable steps. My voice cracked as I whispered into the emptiness. "What would you do, sweetheart?" And just like that, as if she had spoken directly into my heart, the answer became obvious. Get professional help. This wasn't a battle for pride or even just survival. It required expertise far beyond my reach, legal guidance, financial strategy, and knowledge of how criminals operated. For the first time in days, I felt a faint thread of direction. I went to the kitchen drawer and pulled out my old leather address book, its cover smooth and worn from decades of use. Flipping through the pages, I found the name I knew would be there, waiting for me, Richard Wilson, my oldest friend, my comrade from Korea. The man who had stood beside me through weddings, funerals, and every trial in between. If there was anyone who could help me navigate this storm, it was Richard. I dialed his number, my hand trembling slightly, and he picked up on the second ring. "Richard, I need your professional help," I said without preamble. "It's about Brandon and it's serious." His voice, calm and steady, carried the same reassurance it always had. "Of course, Derek. Come to my office tomorrow at 9. Bring whatever documentation you have. No questions asked until then." That was Richard respecting the gravity of silence until it was safe to speak. After hanging up, I moved to my study. The irony struck me hard. Only that morning I had been sitting at this very desk, staring at medical bills weighed down by ordinary financial burdens. Now those worries seemed laughably small compared to the danger pressing in on us. I pulled out a sheet of stationery, the good kind Margaret had once reserved for Christmas letters, and began writing with deliberate care. "My dear Emma and James," I wrote, "Grandfather loves you more than all the stars in the sky. Sometimes families face challenges that require adults to make very difficult decisions. Whatever happens in the days ahead, I want you to remember one thing. Everything I do, every choice I make, comes from love for you both." The letter continued with gentle words carefully chosen to provide reassurance without instilling fear. I wanted them to feel my love, even if circumstances forced distance. When I sealed the envelope, marking it, "For Emma and James." In case of emergency, my hands lingered on it longer than necessary, as though trying to will my love into the paper itself. Then I turned my attention to the grim task of preparation. I organized everything systematically. The video evidence of Brandon shoving me into the lake, financial records showing the extent of my available savings, a timeline of events based on Isabel's testimony, notes about the men who had threatened her and the children. Piece by piece, I constructed a complete picture of where we stood. The numbers were stark, but not hopeless. My savings, while modest, were enough to cover the immediate debt without selling the house. It would drain much of what I had built for my final years, but what good was comfort if Emma and James weren't safe to enjoy visits with their grandfather? For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt clarity, not peace but purpose. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, hard choices, and possibly more danger. But I would not sit idle while shadows closed in on my family. The question that haunted me was simple yet terrifying. In its implications, could professional intervention truly transform this nightmare into a manageable path of legal cooperation? Or had we already crossed a threshold where danger outweighed strategy? Tomorrow, Richard would give me clarity. He would help me see the lines between fear and fact, between personal grief and legal reality. But tonight, I prepared for every possibility. I could not afford to collapse into mourning for the son I thought I knew or the family I once believed was safe. This wasn't the time for grief. This was the time for planning. Richard's law office was housed on the 15th floor of a downtown Minneapolis building, a structure of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun like a fortress of reason against the chaos outside. From its windows, the city stretched in every direction, the same city where my grandchildren were being watched, where debts turned into threats, where my son had become both victim and perpetrator. I arrived 15 minutes early, unable to bear the thought of keeping Richard waiting. His secretary, a kindly woman with graying hair and a steady demeanor, offered me a cup of coffee. I accepted, though my hands trembled slightly as I lifted it, nerves thrumming from a sleepless night. The bitter warmth grounded me, but did little to calm the storm within. The conference room spoke of Richard's long and steady success shelves, lined with law books from floor to ceiling, certificates, framed with polished oak, and photographs of his family smiling in happier times. Those photographs mattered more to me than the law books, for they reminded me why I trusted this man. Above all others, he understood what it meant to love and protect family at any cost. When Richard entered, he carried nothing but a yellow legal pad and a pen, yet his presence filled the room. His expression bore the professional gravity I had seen only a handful of times in our decades of friendship. Once, when we faced enemy fire in Korea, another when he spoke at his wife's funeral. He sat opposite me, leaned forward, and said only, "Show me everything, Derek." I took a deep breath and obeyed. First, I played the phone video. The room filled with Brandon's angry voice with the splash of water as he shoved me into the lake. Richard's jaw tightened, his pen pausing mid-sentence, as though the weight of the act itself demanded a moment of silence. Then I told him everything: Isabel's trembling confession in the cafe, the names of the loan sharks, the escalating threats, the photographs of Emma and James taken outside their school. Richard's pen moved steadily across the page, his handwriting neat but relentless, as though each stroke carved structure out of chaos. He interrupted only to ask precise questions: dates, amounts, owed names, mentioned any physical evidence. His eyes sharpened with each detail, pulling the story apart and reassembling it into a case. By the time I finished, my throat was dry and my coffee cold. Richard set his pen down and looked at me with a mixture of professionalism and the faintest flicker of sorrow. "The video evidence is strong," he said at last. His voice carried the weight of a man who had measured countless battles and was now preparing me for mine. "Elder abuse charges alone carry serious penalties in Minnesota. That's undeniable. But when we add the criminal conspiracy, the threats, the surveillance of the children, that gives us significant leverage." My hands clenched against the polished wood of the table. "What about Emma and James? What about their safety while all of this unfolds? That above all else was my priority. Legal arguments and penalties meant nothing if my grandchildren remained in danger." Richard leaned back slightly, tapping his pen against the pad. "We won't start with prosecution," he said firmly. "Not yet. That would put a spotlight on the family and increase the immediate risk. Instead, we'll structure this as debt negotiation, a controlled process. We'll establish communication with their side, buy us time, and quietly build our case from underneath. Once we have the children secured, then, and only then, we move toward criminal charges." The edges of a strategy began to take shape before me, steady and deliberate, like a chess game guided by a master hand. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt the faintest flicker of control returning. "Your savings can serve as a good faith payment," Richard explained, his tone calm but firm. "It won't erase the debt, but it will buy us time. Time for Brandon's cooperation to develop into something meaningful." The idea landed in me like a stone dropped into deep water. My life savings, accumulated over decades of cautious living, reduced to a bargaining chip. Yet if it meant safeguarding Emma and James, if it gave us even a sliver of advantage against the people holding my family hostage, then it was no sacrifice at all. For the next hour, we worked together, line by line, detail by detail, shaping chaos into strategy. Richard's pen never seemed to rest. He sketched diagrams across the yellow legal pad, boxes and arrows, mapping out possibilities as though he were drafting a military operation. "Escrow arrangements," he explained, tapping his pen on the page, "will protect your financial interests. Funds won't move until conditions are verified. That way you satisfy immediate demands without surrendering everything blindly." I leaned forward, absorbing each word, and Brandon Richards' expression hardened slightly. "He must become part of the solution, not just the problem. We'll design cooperation agreements requiring full disclosure, names, locations, methods, everything he knows about this criminal network. In exchange, the family steps in with assistance. No lies, no half measures. His survival and the family's will depend on his honesty. The word honesty felt almost foreign when applied to my son. But in this room, it became non-negotiable. The key, Richard continued sketching another series of arrows, is timing. We approach the debt holders through controlled legal channels, not in the shadows. We offer structured payment only in return for a documented release of all family members from further obligation. No ambiguity, no loopholes. He underlined the phrase non-negotiable conditions. Then he listed them aloud, one by one, like commandments. Brandon's complete cooperation with law enforcement. Enrollment in a mandatory rehabilitation program to confront his gambling addiction. Financial accountability and education to prevent relapse. Family therapy sessions to repair fractured trust. Regular check-ins, probation-like oversight, ensuring compliance. The room grew silent for a moment as I stared at the list. Each point represented both punishment and mercy, discipline and hope. Can you make these legally enforceable? I finally asked, my voice low but steady. Because good intentions die quickly under family pressure. Richard looked at me with the quiet confidence I had leaned on for decades. Absolutely. We'll structure this as a formal family contract, legally binding with financial consequences for non-compliance. Your assistance isn't charity, Derek, it's conditional on measurable change. If he falters, the safety net disappears. He didn't need to remind me how brutal reality could be. Still, something in me stirred at the thought of accountability tied to love. Maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. Before I left, Richard scheduled a family meeting for Friday afternoon, just 2 days away. That window, he explained, would give him time to establish preliminary contact with the criminal intermediaries to test the waters before we stepped into negotiations. He laid out safety protocols in meticulous detail, emergency phone numbers, surveillance checks, contingency plans if things turn violent. Derek, he said at the office door, resting a hand briefly on my shoulder, this plan addresses the immediate threats, but it also preserves the possibility of long-term family healing. Your patience, your resources, they're creating chances for redemption that didn't exist yesterday. I carried the folder of documents down into the dim parking garage, the weight of it pressing against my briefcase like a second heart. Inside were instructions, contracts, strategies, blueprints for either salvation or disaster. By Friday afternoon, I had transformed my living room into neutral ground. Chairs arranged in a circle as though geometry itself could enforce equality, fairness, and truth. It was the same room where candles once flickered on birthday cakes, where wrapping paper was torn open at Christmas, where laughter had once filled the walls. Now it would become the stage for confrontation, confession, and perhaps, if fate allowed, redemption. Richard was the first to arrive. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents, and calmly reviewed each page with the steady composure of a seasoned attorney. I, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. I paced around the familiar living room, poured more coffee, fluffed the pillows on the sofa, and smoothed the tablecloth, anything to bleed off the nervous energy surging through my veins. The door opened, and Isabel walked in with Emma and James. The kids were like two bursts of sunlight cutting through the heavy air of worry. They ran straight to me, wrapping their little arms around my legs and looking up with those clear, trusting eyes. "Grandpa, can we play with your train set?" Emma asked, tugging gently at my sleeve. I bent down, stroked her soft hair, and gave a tender smile. "In a little while, sweetheart. First, the grown-ups need to have a very important talk." Obediently, they slipped into the corner with their toy box and wooden blocks, quickly absorbed in building tiny castles. But the atmosphere in the room only grew heavier, weighted by what was about to unfold. When Brandon appeared in the doorway, the air seemed to freeze. My son's eyes darkened the moment he saw Richard, the legal pad, the pen, and the leather briefcase laid neatly on the table. "What is this?" Brandon snapped, his shoulders tensing as if ready to fight. "Some kind of forced intervention." I tried to keep my voice calm, gesturing toward the empty chair in the circle I'd arranged. "No, this is a family meeting. Sit down, Brandon." For a few seconds, he stood frozen, blinking rapidly, then finally pulled out a chair. His discomfort was obvious. Richard spoke first, his voice steady and precise, the voice of someone well accustomed to high-stakes situations. "Based on the evidence and testimony, criminal charges could absolutely be filed. But we're not here to destroy Brandon. We're here to find another path, a solution that protects everyone. Brandon leaned back, arms crossed tightly, lips pressed into a hard line. Richard didn't stop. He pulled out a tablet, pressed a button, and the room filled with the sound of Brandon's own furious shouting. The video played him shoving me toward the water, his threats, the wild, desperate look in his eyes. Whatever excuses he had died in his throat. His face shifted, first defensive, then stunned, and finally crumbling into shame. His head dropped, his shoulders sagged, and his eyes reddened with the weight of undeniable truth. "The children," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced toward Emma and James. They remained blissfully unaware, stacking blocks into fragile towers, innocent architects of their own little world. I took a long breath, leaned forward, and fixed my son with a steady gaze. "I'll help you, Brandon, but this ends here. No more secrets, no more shortcuts, no more violence." Brandon lifted his head, eyes glassy with confusion and anger. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under." "Actually, we do," Richard cut in, his voice still calm but sharp as a blade. "And that's exactly why we're offering a structured path forward rather than handing everything straight to the police." He placed his pen on the legal pad and read out each condition brick by brick, like laying down the only bridge Brandon had left. My entire savings would go into a secure trust to pay off his debts. Brandon must fully cooperate with authorities, providing every detail about the crime organization behind him. He would enter mandatory rehabilitation to confront his gambling addiction. The family would commit to therapy to heal the fractures that had split us apart. Regular check-ins and strict oversight would ensure he never slipped back. Each condition was both a key to his future and a rope around him, binding him to one unavoidable choice: change or lose everything. Brandon sat there, his fingers tightly interlaced, trembling as if trying to claw his way out of his own skin. Pride warred violently with the crushing truth he could no longer ignore. Each time his gaze wandered toward Emma and James, still lost in their innocent fortress of colorful wooden blocks, his eyes softened with guilt and longing. But when his attention returned to Richard and me, his expression hardened again, the mask of defiance slipping on as if for one final stand. "I don't really have a choice, do I?" Brandon rasped, his voice cracking. It was less a question than a weary confession. I looked at him steadily, letting my words cut through the heavy silence. "There is always a choice, Brandon. The only question is, are you ready to make the right one?" The room stilled, thick with unspoken tension. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt unbearably loud. Isabel held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, Brandon exhaled in defeat, his shoulders sagging as though he'd just set down a boulder only to pick up another weight entirely. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice raw. "Dad, I'll do whatever it takes, as long as it keeps Emma and James safe, as long as I can earn your trust back." The process began immediately. Richard laid out the documents with professional precision, his tone steady and measured. Brandon signed the cooperation agreements, each stroke of his pen a reluctant admission, but also a fragile step toward redemption. Isabel added her witness statement, hands shaking only slightly as she committed her truth to paper. Richard organized it all into binding legal form, turning chaos into a structured framework. The blue ink carved itself into white pages, evidence of a new beginning, however fragile. For 20 minutes, Emma and James played on their laughter, echoing like music against the thick air of adult negotiations. Their innocence was a shield sparing them from the dark realities that had nearly swallowed their family whole. When it was over, Brandon stood, his face pale but resolute. He dropped to his knees beside the children and pulled them fiercely into his arms. "Daddy's going to be better," he whispered, voice trembling but firm, "starting right now." And for the first time in months, Isabel smiled, not the strained mask she'd worn to survive, but a genuine smile of relief, the weight of fear lifting at last. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rehabilitation programs, therapy sessions, painful family dialogues, every step would demand strength and vulnerability. But the immediate threat was gone, and for now that was enough. Richard gathered his papers into his leather briefcase, snapping it shut with finality. "This framework gives everyone a way forward," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Brandon faces consequences, but also support. The children have safety and stability. And Derek," he turned toward me, "you've created a chance for redemption that simply didn't exist 3 days ago." As the family prepared to leave, I drew Brandon aside. Looking into his tear-streaked eyes, I rested a firm hand on his shoulder. I love you, son. I always have. But love needs boundaries now. Do you understand? Brandon nodded, voice breaking, as he replied. I understand. And, thank you, Dad. Thank you for not giving up on us. I stood at the porch watching their car roll slowly down the driveway. Inside me, the rage that had once burned hot was cooling, replaced by something unfamiliar, cautious hope. The betrayal wasn't erased, and the wounds weren't healed overnight. But a first step had been taken, built on truth, on hard conversations, and on the guiding hand of a professional who refused to let us shatter. For the first time in days, I breathed deeply, and with that breath came something I thought I had lost. Oh yeah. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left